Very good.
Oops.
Well, I wanted to welcome everyone this evening. This is Wednesday night, the 21st. It's the night before official Earth Day, and this is the Earth Day celebration week that's being put on by a combination of Dakota Rural Action and Rapid City Sustainability Committee. And I want to welcome you all who are joining us tonight. Our presentation is entitled The Timber Sustainability on the Black Hills National Forest. And tonight we have a couple of members from the Norbeck Society, including Mary Zimmerman and Dave Mertz, who are going to make the presentations tonight. And in terms of if anyone has questions, you can either post them in the chat or we'll take everyone off mute at the end and you can ask your questions in person if you prefer that. So we can let Dave and Mary lead us through this presentation, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Turn it over to you, Mary.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Rick. I'm Mary Zimmerman. I'm Vice President of the Norbeck Society, and Bob Burns is with us today too. He's the president. And then Dave Mertz is a retired Forest Service employee. So our presentation tonight, I'll just say it's not extremely formal. I've just got a queue of some charts and photos that we can use to help illustrate what we're talking about. It's a pretty complex topic, and you know, we hope tonight to kind of bring you to a better understanding of a picture of the forest and kind of the implications of what's happening, and which is not all good. And then we also want to share with you some things that perhaps you could do to help with the situation. So, when we talk about sustainability, we're talking about the timber program on the Black Hills National Forest, and you know, now we've got a pretty good picture of the shape of the forest. Because of science, we can measure things pretty exactly. But I wanted to just start with just a kind of a view back in time and kind of start thinking about the shape of the forest, you know, how big the trees are, how many there are. And I had visited back in 2016 with Blaine Cook, who was the forest silviculturist at the time. And he talked in terms of billion board feet, and Dave's going to have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Blaine told me that upon white settlement in the Black Hills back in the 1800s, there was approximately 2 billion board feet of merchantable timber on the forest. Now by 1995, that had increased to triple that, about 6 billion. And in 2016, when I was talking with Blaine, I think he said that we were down to by about 3.2 or so. And I think now we're below 3. I think we're like around 2.9 billion board feet on the forest. So the measurement has changed, and so has the quality of the forest. And you can kind of see in this old photo, you know, these really big ponderosas that have been groomed by fire, basically. And you'll see photos coming up of the way the forest looks now. But anyway, we've been measuring the forest, and we've got, well, I guess actually here's a stump from an old cut and this is in the Nemo area and the old Case 1 area. But you can see, look, this is looking out the edge of the Sundown timber sale just a month or so ago. So we've had reports lately in the last number of years from forest inventory and analysis. They measure plots in the forest and keep data. And this started to become really important back in 2013 with the publication of this report about the forests in 2011. And that's when the data started to show a depletion, a decline in the inventory, which, as you remember, peaked in around 1995. And since then, we've gotten more data. I don't know why I show that, but let's see, I'm going to get kind of mixed up. Here we go. So this is from the more recent data, and I don't know where you want to pick up your tape, but we want to kind of talk about the latest report. There's a general technical report that came out recently. Some of you might have seen the webinar about this report, but it's showing that we're diving deeper and deeper to lower levels with the inventory, and there's no sign of that stopping. And it's at this point mainly because of harvesting. We've had big fires that had impacts. We've had that big mountain pine beetle outbreak, and we've also had harvests, but now those are what's kind of overtaking the inventory, and there's really no sign of it stopping. So I wondered, Dave, if you would talk a little bit about forest management and the laws that govern what can happen on the forest.
Okay. So yeah, there's a few laws that the Forest Service has to pay attention to. There's the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, which I think was from 1960, which it laid the groundwork for every time that the Forest Service, that the Congress has made new laws regarding the Forest Service. It's almost always as a result of something bad happened. And then the Congress looks to try to address it and make sure it doesn't happen again. So the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act laid the groundwork to make sure that, yes, the Forest Service is a multiple use agency. There's no one resource that takes precedence over any of the other resources, and timber is one of those. But there's others: recreation, range, water, etc. But it laid the groundwork for that. You had to have for the resources that the forest would produce, you wanted it to be sustainable well into the future. And then along came the National Forest Management Act in 1976, and that was really a result of a couple of other things that the Forest Service kind of did that got real bad attention. And the National Forest Management Act is really pretty wide ranging and covers a lot of things for the Forest Service. But with regards to what we're talking about tonight, it requires that the Forest Service has a sustainable, long-term sustained yield of its timber program, and it says into perpetuity. So that means that over time, the Forest Service, you cannot harvest more timber than what is growing, and then you have to deduct the natural mortality that occurs as well from fires and bugs and things like that. So that is pretty important, and it's really a basis for forestry, that you don't want to harvest more than what you're growing out there. Obviously, if you do, and that goes on for a period of time, at some point you don't have any trees left, and you don't want that, and certainly not on a national forest. So this issue really came to the forefront for those of us working here on the Black Hills. Like Mary was saying, probably around 2013. That was after, you know, there'd been numerous fires, the Jasper fire and others in the 2000s, and then and concurrent with that really was the mountain pine beetle epidemic, which by 2011, 2012 was really expanding greatly. And those of us looking at the condition of the forest, the inventory of the forest, were saying, oh man, we're really having some impacts here. But we wanted to continue thinning because the thinning was viewed as the best way at that time to mitigate the mountain pine beetle impacts. But that really ended, the mountain pine beetle epidemic ended about 2016, came to an end. It went back down to endemic levels. And those of us that were looking at the situation said we really needed to take a look at what we were going to do with the timber program, because we felt, a number of us felt like we needed to make some reductions. Otherwise, we were going to be in a situation where we would not have a sustainable timber program. There was already evidence that we were already in that situation. At that time, we approached the timber industry. We'd really been talking to them before that, really, actually for years, about this issue. They were very hesitant about making any reductions because obviously that was going to hurt their business. They felt at the time, or at least they said, that they didn't feel like we had good enough data to make drastic changes on the forest. And at that time, we agreed to double the inventory that the forest usually did and do it over a 3-year time frame to gather the best data that we could. We did that for 3 years. We actually installed twice as many plots as we already had, measured everything over a 3-year time period, and that's when we came up with the draft general technical report, which I guess we'll get into that here in a little later. So is that good enough for right now? Do you want me?
So, do you want to keep going?
No, I don't know if you want that chart explained or.
Yeah, I think this would be, this is from the final report that just came out in March. A draft had come out more than a year ago, and then there was a lot of foot dragging to get the final version of this report from the scientists from the Rocky Mountain Research Station to get this out. But it finally did. We think it might have to do with some letters that we wrote. But yeah, I think it's hard to get your head around this, but maybe you should just try to explain this chart. I liked the scientist Mike Pataglia's comparison with an individual's finances and your savings account. I don't know if you want to go at it like that, Dave, or
I can give it a try. Yeah, I thought that
Okay.
was a good approach that they did. Basically, what they were saying is, well, okay, you have a savings account, and everything above the line the zero line there, that's what you have in your savings account. And you have some interest there that you're growing every year. So the dark green, well, the lighter green is your net growth. After, you know, every year you're going to get some growth on the forest. That's always going to happen. But so that starts out with your gross growth. Then you're going to have some impacts to your savings account, basically, where you're going to make some withdrawals. And those would be everything at the bottom below the zero line. And those consist of natural mortality, which would be the fires and bugs, weather, wind events, you know, ice storms, tornadoes, all that. And then also timber harvesting. So those are your withdrawals out of your account. So back in 1962, we were still doing pretty well because when you subtracted your harvesting and your natural mortality, you still had a positive net growth there. So, and that continues even as timber harvesting went up in 1984 and 1999. And around that time frame, the forest inventory really kind of peaked during that time frame. And you can see that we were still in pretty good shape because you still had a net growth that was pretty significant. You were adding to your savings account at that point. But that all changed over the next decade, because if you see below the line there, your mortality went up considerably. So your withdrawals out of your account were getting bigger, and that was due to wildfires primarily and mountain pine beetle. And then also, if you look, the timber harvesting was increasing as well. And like I described here a little bit ago, some of that was due to because of the efforts we were taking to try to address the mountain pine beetle. So you could see in 2011 that you were starting to have some issues with your net growth. And then that continues on into 2017, which is, you know, after the mountain pine beetle was really winding down, but we were into some serious problems there because, you know, your net change was significantly into the negative. So you're taking your savings account and you're actually losing money at that point, because you're taking way more out than what you have than what you're putting in. And then in 2019, that shows you that we're into some serious problems, and all this has led to a pretty significant decline in the forest inventory on the forest. So.
And so the implication is that at the level we've been harvesting, the forest, you know, to have trees in it is unsustainable. That I think the draft report said that in 34 years at the current rate, we would have no more mature trees. That would be trees taken off of every steep slope, every riparian area, every picnic area, and all that. So, and they had given a projection at that time, more than a year ago, that it was something like half of the current cut would be sustainable. I had made a chart just to kind of show a picture. Oh, I guess now I've lost that. There it is. To kind of show what the volume is, and the number that goes with the current Black Hills National Forest harvest, or at least the target that's given, is in terms of centum cubic feet, 100 cubic feet, and it's 181,000 centum cubic feet, or CCF. We've learned now that a sustainable harvest, one that would keep the inventory level so that it wasn't in depletion, would be 70 to 90,000 CCF, but that's not taking into consideration other values, and it's not taking into consideration that some parts of the forest are just inaccessible or needed for recreation or wildlife, things like that. So a sustainable harvest number is going to be less than the 70 to 90,000 CCF. So that's because we've kind of come under this pressure from industry, and then politicians have jumped into their aid to keep the cut up. The forest personnel have to go and find trees to cut, and that's really driven a lot of kind of nasty effects on the forest. So they're going on a plan that was made, a forest plan that was made and finalized in 1997, but that was when the forest was at that 6 billion board foot inventory. And so they've come up with some projects based on that forest plan, notably the Black Hills Resilient Landscapes Project. And this was a project that was supposed to bring in a lot of volume to the mills. It would cut trees on over 183,000 acres. And it's probably, as it turns out, not a suitable project for our forest in the condition that it's in, and yet it is going forward. So there is an implementation interactive map that is available online. And this is just a screenshot of that. And we can see all of those little gold and black marks. And actually I haven't, this is an old screenshot. So if I had done it again now today, there would be more, but these are all these are all harvests that are being done in the Mountain Pine Beetle Response Project. And the point here is that, when you have to go get volume and it's hard to find, we seem to be doing things that really aren't that good for the forest. And that tack is going to get more and more evident as this project continues to move forward. It's a 10-year project, and it started in 2018. So it's been going on for 2.5 years. But they're doing a lot of what they call overstory removal. So, like this is just pinpointing on the map here a sale called Maverick. And we're going to look at a photo from unit 19 or cutting unit 19. It's called Harvest Without Restocking. Actually, this isn't that unit. I must have gotten that mixed up. Well, this is from the Maverick sale also, but it comes off as a clear cut. We're finding that where they go in and do these overstory removals, we have one of two situations. One is where there's, almost no trees left, and then other situations where it's packed full of dog hair, like you see here. So here the machines are just driving over the thickets that have grown up and not been thinned to snatch out large trees. You can kind of see the big tree over on the right side of the picture. That's a tree that's going to get cut, and then we kind of get left with the dog hair. This is actually the unit that was marked in that last map you saw. And to me, it was just this is the poster child for what our forest should be, and yet it's being cut down. It's just a beautiful old growth, open park-like stand. This stand is in no danger if there's a forest fire. It's got lots of good air circulation in the case of a beetle outbreak. Nothing wrong with it, but it got cut down. And this is, at a time when we have almost no old growth left on the forest. And that one's kind of up north here in the northern hills. Down south, we got the example of the marble timber sale. And these are all sales that are happening out of the Black Hills Resilient Landscapes project. So this showing the opposite problem. And I want to say this whole timber sale covered about 9,600 acres, so under 10,000 acres. Much of it where it hadn't already been beetle killed, done with overstory removal. So in that whole 9,000+ acre area, to this day, there's very little in the way of mature trees. No one's going to be going in there in the next 100 years to do a timber harvest. And this is a photo that Dave took. You want to talk about what it shows there?
Yeah, this is from, they call this the Grand Vista. It's up just west of the Medicine Mountain Boy Scout camp. But you look out over a lot of acres, and if you look closely, almost every ridge out there has skid trails on it. And all this area out here, those trees that are remaining are about the same size. They're 10 to 15 foot tall, and they're very thick dog hair stands. And that's those skid trails through there. That's what they had to do when they cut the large trees and skidded those out of there. So unbelievably, you got hundreds of acres out there that look the same. There are these 10 to 15 foot tall trees that are way too dense, and no large trees left out there. It's the Forest Service now needs to go in there and thin all those. Otherwise, all they've really done is left a mess. But the problem with this is that they get the money to put in the timber sales, but they don't have nearly the funding they need to go in there and pay a contractor to go in and thin all these dense stands of younger trees. They'll probably get around to it, but it may take truthfully decades before they get out there and do a good job of thinning all that. So they've just really, from a forester perspective, I think they pretty much just left a mess out there.
Yeah, so we've just got some photos here of recent cutting under the Burl project. Burl is short for Black Hills Resilient Landscapes project. And I guess what we want to have you know is that this is not being driven by, what would be good for the forest or other uses of the forest. This is being driven very strongly by the power of the timber industry and of the politicians that get campaign donations from them, frankly. And it's been a very hard nut to crack because there seems to be no reasoning that will get through to elicit a change to this. And of course, in the long run, this is not good for the timber industry. But anymore, I guess they think in terms of what they can get now. So, where there's not enough trees, you can see here the impacts to the ground are really substantial. In some cases, there might not be enough trees to regenerate a new forest with the seeds that fall from them. Damage to habitat for plants and animals is significant. And then often, as we both said, we're left with these dense stands, these thickets of dog hair. Now, going forward into the future, I think it'll be very difficult to get this cleaned up. And of course, it's the next mountain pine beetle outbreak on the way. And in the case of a fire, this is extremely hazardous. And having, like in the case of this picture that you're looking at now, having removed the large trees out of this area has really done nothing to mitigate risk of fire. So all in all, even though a lot of this is done kind of sanctioned by the forest plan, that forest plan from 97 really isn't appropriate for this forest anymore. And so all of the things that are happening are in question. So it's not really good for anyone. Maybe let's see what our next picture is. And I think I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening to try to persuade us that logging more is good. The Norbeck Society, and certainly not any of the retired Forest Service personnel, nobody involved in our efforts wants to completely, we're not against logging. We just want it to be done sustainably and in the service of a better forest. And so often we get framed as being against logging. Well, actually, the truth is we're more pro-logging than the logging industry itself, it seems. But they're doing a lot to try to persuade the public that everything's okay. You don't see this along the major roads. Most of the really bad stuff is hidden from view. The public really isn't aware of the extent to which this is happening. And then the lobbyist is working overtime, contacting and meeting with county commissioners. They put press releases out to every news media outlet again and again, and they spin it to their benefit. They've done extensive infomercials. They've got Facebook pages, billboards, t-shirts, all of this stuff. Some of their main tactics are to make the public afraid of fire, which, of course, I'm afraid of fire, but they link logging with not having fires. They say that logging will prevent fires, and maybe in some cases that's true, but that's not really what's happening generally on the Black Hills. Especially when stuff like this dog hair is left. They also talk about, the mountain pine beetle, how you have to keep up with the logging in order to not have these beetle outbreaks. Well, there again, that's not what's happening. Our forest is becoming more fire prone and more insect prone. And then one of the other things they also do is they talk about historical conditions, and they say there used to be a lot less trees. Well, that's true. There were less trees. At White Settlement, 2 billion board feet. We've got probably about 2.8 or 9 billion board feet right now, but there's the volume, but then there's the quality of that forest. And when you go from huge old pines that have survived fire after fire, whose branches are way up high, and a cleansed forest floor that's had frequent fire to keep the dog hair out, that's a very different forest than the logging is making today. The logging is really making our forest with more trees and smaller trees. And then they talk about the economic impacts of industry here. And that's just great to have that here as a part of our local economy. But if it's damaging the forest, that's a problem. And then, you know, even just that eventually they'll run themselves out of business and we won't have a mill points to a need to rein this in soon. They always connect logging with forest health. Well, you know, what's going on now, it's not forest health. One of the really awful things that's happening is that they're having, Forest Service, to get this volume out, is having to go into stands repeatedly. There are many stands being harvested in the Burl project that were just harvested, you know, were just thinned, you know, taking down from a dense stand to a sparse stand just 5-6 years ago. So now they're being entered again with heavy machinery and the remaining trees are being cut. So I don't know, what else do we need to say? And then maybe we should open it up to questions. Bob and I and Dave have all been doing a lot. I'll just say for myself, it's discouraging often. We feel sometimes like we're just banging our heads against the wall, but I think as things become more and more drastic, you know, people will see what's going on. Here's the names of 3 people who seem unconvinced at this point that the harvest needs to be brought down. And we have other names and addresses for people who are interested. Oh geez, I put the wrong email address there. I don't know why I did that. I'm going to put the Norbeck Society email in the chat. And if anyone wants to ask more questions, we can do that.
Good.
So,
So I'm going to let everyone unmute themselves. And let me see if I can do this. And then I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone does have a question for Dave or Mary, speak up and let us hear from you.
So this is Rebecca, and I do have a question. So we're having dinner here with a group and watching the presentation, and we wanted to know what the impact of local wood heating has on the forest. And is that a major source of impact on the sustainability of forests? Or like, what are the major impacts in terms of like pulling that market, you know, toward harvesting more timber? Thank you.
So you're asking about the people burning firewood in their homes?
Yes, that's correct. And, you know, and I would say, and beyond that, of course, because a lot of people maybe harvest their own, is like wood pellets, bagged wood pellets, etc. So like, I mean, beyond, you know, sort of that specific question, what are sort of the major sources of that market pull on, you know, on harvesting the timber in the Black Hills?
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, the firewood is really not an issue because there's an abundant source of firewood here. I mean, when they do these timber sales, a lot of times what they do is they cut down the tree and they skid the entire tree out to a landing, and that's where they cut off all the branches and the small parts, smaller diameter parts of the tree, and they build those gigantic piles that you see around the forest. There's literally thousands of those out there on the forest, and those are available to people for firewood. And actually, if they come and cut off of those, it's a good thing. Somebody's making use of it, because otherwise eventually they just the Forest Service comes along and burns those piles up. So firewood is really not an issue. It's people want dead material that's already dry, so that's not an issue. The pellets, I would say that that's not really an issue either because, well, Nyman Industries do make pellets in spearfish, but that's really made from kind of byproduct of their sawmilling process. So it's kind of like the waste that they get off of that, the sawdust and that. So they make those pellets from that. So that's not really an issue. In fact, it's just making good use of what would otherwise go to waste. So here in the Black Hills, there's really two things, primarily two ways that the trees are being used. Nyman Industries basically cuts their saw logs up into 1-inch boards, and those are used for a variety of purposes, and they go sell those to a variety of, and as well as to, you can buy them at Menards and that. So that's what they use theirs for. Then there's also, and those are trees that are 9 inches in diameter and greater. So those are called saw logs, and that's what those are generally used for. Then there's the trees that are 6 inches to 9 inches. And those, there's a market for those as well. Primarily, and that's used to make fence posts and poles. So those are the real two driving markets here in the Black Hills for what our trees are used for. Did that answer your question? Or?
It did, thank you.
I'm seeing, oh, let's see, I'm seeing a question about that chart. Why is it only interim data over the last decade?
Interim data?
Yeah, on that, on this chart. Right. Oh, did you see above 2017? It says interim data. I guess I don't know what that's. Oh, that's where the plots were doubled. Is that right?
That would, yeah, that would be right. So, so in 2017 they hadn't gathered all that extra data, so that was kind of like a subset of their data. But by 2019 they had all of it. So.
Okay, I'm sorry, Dave. I thought that it was 2011 on. There's a big dark heavy line down the middle that says under year. And I thought interim data was all of that, but it's only 2017.
Yeah, that line kind of, that dark line, Rick, shows where the, we entered depletion basically.
Okay.
Which,
also,
I think, oh, go ahead.
It also shows where they started doing annual inventories instead of every 5 years.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
It lists that down at the bottom.
Right.
And the annual inventories were more accurate, they said, because when they did them every 5 years, they may have missed trees that died and fell over, and they only counted standing dead trees. I guess to prevent them from counting trees that had been taken during a harvest. So when the annual inventories came in, the mortality was reflected a little bit better and maybe underreported prior to that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So everybody, Bob was heavily engaged in a lot of this data last summer when he was part of a working group for the National Forest Advisory Board, analyzing all things forest inventory to try to make some kind of recommendation to the Forest Service about what a sustainable cut would be. Do you want to talk about that, Bob?
Well, it was we met almost weekly all summer long, and we were kind of waiting for the final GTR to come out, the peer-reviewed version, which it never did. And it was suggested that we just end our committee and not go on, since we didn't really have that final data. But the majority wanted to come up with some sort of a recommendation before NFAB closed for the year. And so they did that. But because of that kind of lack of information in some part, we were unable to come to consensus. I think the vote was 3 or 4 to 2 to recommend they continue at the 181. And the other 2 of us, Glissa Kruger from the Nature Conservancy, we both thought that we should wait for a decision until we had more information, and that we should not be so, I guess, ambitious in saying that we could continue with the 181.
So Rebecca is asking, we've heard about a market on specialty bugwood from the pine beetle destroyed lumber. Was that just a tiny niche of the market, or has it been a larger industry windfall? Well, I can say for one thing, I believe that that they paid less for the bugwood than for live trees. Is that correct, Dave?
Yeah, but as it turned out, there was a real a kind of a niche market for that. Some people used it to make paneling, which a lot of people liked. It was I thought it looked pretty nice, actually. But that when the pine beetle epidemic ended, that pretty much ended that as well. The reason being that once the bugs got into a tree, the shelf life of that tree was really short. So once the bugs killed the tree, if it wasn't sawn up for lumber within 2 or 3 months, it would go bad. So there's really none of that around anymore. And there won't be until there's another pine beetle epidemic.
You know, that was mentioned in the newspaper the other day, that in the 70s and 80s, the Forest Service, they harvested those bug trees and made lumber out of them, especially paneling. And that's true. And you could see in my house and many buildings, they have that blue stained wood. The problem is now the major sawmills are selling lumber to big box stores who devalue it if you have a stain in it or if you have a bug hole. And so their position was they got paid a lot less for that and couldn't hardly make money. And they had to harvest healthy trees along with those to keep their operation going. You know, maybe the lack of smaller sawmills is one of the reasons that those blue stain trees weren't being used as much. I even talked to someone who said, you know, I wanted that blue stain wood paneling, and I had to import it from California because we couldn't get any around here at a very expensive price. So it's an unusual situation that you have a volume of timber that is really wanted and needed by some people for its decorative purposes, and yet the industry can't really use it because they're selling to a different market right now.
I have a question for you guys. Why can't the Forest Service, when they let these logging contracts, why can't they stipulate that guys don't leave it in such bad shape that they have to get rid of some of the dog hair? They have to, thin out some of these small stands that they can take all the lumber they want, but they have to leave it in a certain condition. Isn't there some way that they could force a contract on these guys to do a better job?
Dave,
Yeah, they,
Dave-
oh.
well, I was going to talk about stewardship contracts,
Yeah.
which Dave can explain better than I could, but that in those contracts, the thinning is included in the logging sale. But I also understand some of the big mills, it's a nuisance. That they
Yeah.
don't like to do that.
Yeah, there's two different kinds of contracts that they use, and the stewardship contracts do allow for that. And so when they put that out for bid, there's the trees and the value of the trees. And then there's also this other associated work that they're going to require the purchaser to do. And that may be like thinning the smaller non-commercial trees. The problem that we've had in the past was the stumpage value, what the trees were worth, what wasn't that high. So the timber sale itself from selling the trees wasn't generating that much money, so that you couldn't then offset that work that you wanted to do against that value, because there wasn't enough funding to get a lot of that work done. Now the values are up, so they are generating more money, so they hopefully will be able to get more of that work done. But like Bob said, a lot of times the timber industry people don't really like those contracts, because they don't, to do that other kind of work is kind of a nuisance for them. And they don't like to mess with it, but they do it if they have to. And so there are some of those contracts out there.
Yeah, well, it seems like you said that sometimes, the Forest Service doesn't have the money. It may be decades before they get back there. And then it's got to cost more 10 or 20 years from now than to do it right when they're out there with all their equipment and whatever. And so it just seems like there ought to be more emphasis to try to make that happen when the logging occurs.
Yeah, I would totally agree. Anytime you put off necessary work, it's just going to get more expensive down the line. So yeah, you're right.
And you've also lost 20 years of growth in those trees because they've stagnated.
That's true too.
Yeah. The other thing is, one of the tools that Forest Service could use to manage those small trees is prescribed burning. And that's something that the timber industry has really tried to put the kibosh on. I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons the forest was the way it was at White Settlement was because of the fire frequency, these frequent, cool, relatively cool fires that would clean out the understory and retain the large trees. Well, I've literally heard timber industry employees talking about how they don't like it. And then our congressional delegation a couple of years ago installed a law that made it even more difficult for the Forest Service to do that. So, those things really help the small plants under the trees too. It's like fertilizer in a light coating across the entire garden. So now when we shove all of the logging waste into one pile and burn it, it would be like if you dropped a bag of fertilizer in one corner of your garden. And what good does it do there? The other thing that a lot of people don't understand is that, you know, there's a real drive in forestry to grow more trees. Well, here in the Black Hills, we've kind of overdone that, but there's a concept of basically tilling the earth to help the pine seedlings get a leg up. I think the exact word is to reduce competition with forbs. So they want less of all the other plants and then get this proliferation of young pine trees. They call it scarifying the soil. So the logging equipment, you know, if it's the tractor tires and all that, that roughs up the land. One of the things that the Norbeck Society objected to in the Black Hills Resilient Landscapes project is something called mechanical site prep. And I want to say they had proposed that there would be like 20,000 acres basically tilled, you know, with like a deep plow that would rough up the ground where it was being dominated by grasses that were preventing a lot of pines from sprouting up. So they did, because of our objection, they took that off the menu of things to do. However, every time they go out with that machinery, it turns over and digs up the ground, and sometimes very severely. It's not, you know, the way some of us casual recreationalists, when we go out and we think that the Forest Service is managing the forest for our pleasure and this botanical wonderland. You know, the nitty gritty of logging is pretty counter to that, in my opinion. I'm willing to accept, you know, some logging, but I find what's happening now just a disgrace. And it's really setting us up where, you know, a lot of people won't even know what this forest can be. And recovery from this, if it ever happens, is way down the road, well beyond, you know, the time I'll be around. So it's something that needs to change. And I'd like to hear, you know, from some of the other participants, maybe a little bit of a discussion now. I'd like to know what stands out for you, or what you don't understand, or what you do understand. Maybe.
Well, there was a question here about the issue of housing development in the hills and how that impacts the willingness to accept controlled burns, and that is, there's some truth to that. I mean, because there's so much private land scattered throughout the national forest as well as homes, and it does make prescribed burning a little trickier. And but nonetheless, there's a lot of places that don't have as much private land. There's large tracts out there, and they're still not doing burning on those. So I don't know. They need to do a lot better on that. There's just a real hesitancy here to do prescribed burning.
Yeah, I think that it would be a little bit of a learning curve for the public to become more receptive to that. But, you know, personally, I've had one done just adjacent to my property back in 1997. And I tell you what, it was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to that patch of ground. I mean, it made it very vibrant. The diversity of plant life went up exponentially. And they did it after they did some logging, you know, not a clear cut, but a thinning, you know, which is not what's happening now. They call it thinning. They say the forest needs to be thinned, but basically it already has been thinned, which is the ideal setting for a prescribed burn, one, you know, where you've got trees overhead that can survive the burn. And, you know, I mean, I can't speak highly enough of what it did for the land, and I did not feel endangered at all. I mean, I was home that time, at that time, and I had, someone came over and gave me a riding lesson that afternoon while they burned the hill. I mean, it wasn't anything terrifying at all. You know, later in the afternoon, it got a little smoky, you know, but it wasn't a big deal. And within a year, you know, after a winter in the next season, when the new growth came up, it was just amazing.
If anyone else wants to ask a question, feel free. Got a few folks left on here. Well, I'm going to ask Dave or Bob a question. I mean, rather than burning, I mean, we're just putting all that carbon in the atmosphere. Is there any way to like chip it all and just leave it as a benefit to the forest floor? Or is burning the only thing that can be done with all those little sticks and pieces?
Well, so you're saying chip it on site and then just spread it out on the floor?
Yeah. Would that help or hurt the forest?
Well, I don't know the exact science on that, but you'd obviously you'd create a lot of because you gotta have some machines that are gonna run the chippers, right? And then also the fact that all that material is decaying out there, that releases carbon dioxide out there as well. So I mean, the more practical would be if a lot of that material can be chipped and then hauled off site for other uses. Which there's been some of that here on the Black Hills. But the economics of it is often pretty tight. And there probably needs to be some other technology developed to make better use of that. That's probably the best way to deal with all that.
Yeah, instead of
just burning it up.
Yeah, and instead of burning it, they could do lop and scatter.
Yeah, you could do that too.
Instead of whole tree harvesting, where they're hauled to one place and then. And when we had our last timber sale a few years ago, we looked at that option. Nyman had us go look at a sale near Spearfish where they did lop and scatter, but it looked pretty rugged because the way they deal with that slash lane on the ground to get it down to the 18 inches is to run over it with heavy equipment with big lugs on it. And the resulting landscape looked pretty bleak. Whereas you do the whole tree harvesting and all that stuff is hauled away, so it doesn't look as bad after the timber sale, but the slash piles are a continuing nuisance to keep the weeds out, to get them restored to grass. And so on our private land, we think we're gonna try and do lop and scatter 20 years from now when we have another timber sale. And I'm guessing that is probably gonna cost us some money, that it's not as efficient for the logging companies to do it that way.
Yeah, most of the loggers here now are set up to do whole tree logging, so that's what they want to do.
Seems like maybe we're kind of at a null here, so I think at this point, unless someone else has any questions, we're gonna let these good folks go and thank the Norbeck Society tonight, Mary and Dave and Bob. And I know you put the action up there to contact our Congress people, and I think that would be a good thing to do. So unless there's any more questions, we'll say goodnight to everyone and thank you for your attendance, and also thank you for the presentation and informing us of what's going on out in our Black Forest.
I'd like to make just a little announcement. There's not too many people here to hear it, but tomorrow night, I think it's going to be around after 7 our time. Greg Jostin and I, the state forester, will be on public radio talking about the GTR and sustainable logging. They're having an Earth Day program on tomorrow night on public radio or public TV. Yeah, public radio.
Radio.
No, it's going to be on television, on public television. Yeah.
Okay, well, everybody should look that up and check in with that. So I think with that, we're gonna just say goodnight then. And again, thank you all for your participation and your interest in keeping our Black Hills vibrant and growing in the future. So thank you. I'm gonna,
Thanks.
thank you. Good night.